Judge Winters thought he was about to convict a clueless teenager, until Carter, 19-year-old boy, started dismantling the case like a top defense attorney. At the defendant's table, a teenager stood alone, his hands casually in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. No lawyer sat beside him, no expensive suit, just him, young, confident, and, in the eyes of most people in that room, completely out of his depth. At the bench, Judge Harold Winters let out a slow, amused sigh. He was a man who had seen everything: hardened criminals, career con artists, reckless kids who thought they were smarter than the law. This boy? He was just another name on the docket, another lost cause trying to fight a system that had already made up its mind. Winters adjusted his glasses, peering down at the case file in front of him. Carter Hayes, 19, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. A serious charge, one that would normally require a well-seasoned attorney to navigate. Instead, Carter stood there alone, hands in his pockets, as if he had nowhere else to be. The judge smirked. "Let me guess, kid. You watched a few episodes of a courtroom drama and thought you could play lawyer?" Laughter rippled through the room. The bailiff, the clerks, even the prosecutor. They all thought it was a joke. But Carter didn't flinch. His face stayed neutral, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady as they met the judge's. He didn't need to say a word, because he already knew something they didn't, and in a few minutes they'd all regret underestimating him. The courtroom was still buzzing from the judge's remark, but Carter remained silent. He didn't need to respond. Not yet. He had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. Instead of firing back, he simply let the laughter echo through the room, waiting for it to fade. Judge Winters leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the wooden desk in front of him. His smirk hadn't faded. "Let's make this quick," he said, flipping open Carter's case file. "I don't have time to entertain a kid playing dress-up as a lawyer." The prosecutor, David Reynolds, was already rising from his seat, buttoning his navy blue suit as he approached the jury. He was everything Carter expected: polished, prepared, and overconfident. This was just another case for him, another routine conviction before he moved on to the next one. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reynolds began, his voice smooth, practiced. "What we have here is a simple case. The defendant, Carter Hayes, was caught behind the wheel of a stolen 2021 BMW, fleeing from the scene of the crime. When officers attempted to pull him over, he led them on a chase through the city, endangering pedestrians and law enforcement alike." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes sweeping over the jurors. And when he was finally stopped, did he surrender? He ran. Because guilty people run. The prosecution has overwhelming evidence, security footage, police testimony, and even the defendant's own fingerprints inside the vehicle. This case is open and shut. Reynolds turned slightly, looking directly at Carter for the first time, his lips curving into a faint smirk. The defense? Well, there is no defense, because Carter Hayes thought it would be a good idea to represent himself. Another wave of laughter rippled through the courtroom. The judge exhaled, already growing impatient. "All right, let's get this over with," he muttered. "Mr. Hayes, you're up. Try not to waste my time." Finally, Carter moved. He pulled his hands from his pockets, stepped forward, and placed both palms flat on the defendant's table. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence build, just like he planned. Then, in a voice steady and sharp, he said, "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to correct a mistake made by the prosecution." Reynolds let out a small chuckle. "Oh? And what mistake is that?" Carter turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "The one where you claim I was driving the stolen car." The laughter in the room stopped. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A pause, a hesitation. Carter didn't look away. "Because that's not true," he continued, "and you know it." The judge raised an eyebrow, suddenly a little more interested. The jury exchanged glances. The spectators in the gallery leaned in, waiting for what would come next. Because now, Carter had their attention, and he wasn't letting go. A hush fell over the courtroom. The confident laughter that had filled the room moments ago had disappeared, replaced by an uneasy silence. Carter stood there, his hands still resting on the defendant's table, his posture steady. He wasn't smiling, wasn't nervous, wasn't trying to prove a point just yet. He was simply letting them sit with the weight of his words. Judge Winters squinted at him. "Are you saying the prosecution's claim is false?" Carter didn't blink. "I'm saying they don't have the proof they think they do." He turned his gaze back to Reynolds, who was still standing by the jury box, his smirk slightly faded, but not gone. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, giving a small shrug. "We have security footage of the stolen car, your fingerprints inside the vehicle, and police reports confirming that officers pursued you. So, please, enlighten us. What part of that isn't proof?" Carter nodded slightly, as if he had expected this. "Let's start with the security footage," he said. "Prosecution claims they have video evidence placing me inside the stolen BMW. I'd like to see it." Reynolds waved a hand toward the bailiff. "Already prepared." A moment later, the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, taken from a parking lot security camera. It showed a dark-colored BMW pulling up to a convenience store, idling for a moment before a hooded figure stepped out and walked inside. Reynolds gestured toward the screen. "That's the stolen vehicle, and that's the defendant." Carter tilted his head slightly, watching carefully. Then he let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Interesting," he said. The judge raised an eyebrow. "What's interesting?" Carter turned back toward the screen, nodding toward the hooded figure entering the store. "The timestamp on this footage, 9:36 p.m. Can we all agree on that?" Judge Winters glanced at the screen, then back at Carter. "Go on." Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded receipt, stepping toward the judge's bench. "This is from a different store," he said. "A gas station on the other side of town. The timestamp, 9:38 p.m., 2 minutes after that footage was taken." Reynolds frowned slightly. "And?" Carter turned to face him fully now. "And," he said slowly, "this receipt proves I wasn't anywhere near that BMW at the time the prosecution claims I was driving it." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reynolds shifted slightly but quickly regained his composure. "That doesn't mean anything. You could have had someone else buy something for you to create an alibi." Carter smirked for the first time. "Right, except this receipt was paid for with my debit card." He turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, if necessary, I can request my bank statement, which will verify this purchase was made in real time." The judge exhaled, rubbing his chin as he considered this. For the first time since the trial began, the confidence in the prosecution's case had been shaken. Carter turned back toward the jury. "The prosecution built this case around the idea that I was the driver of the stolen vehicle. But if I was across town when this video was taken, then that means one thing." He paused, letting the tension build. "They have the wrong person." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The jury exchanged uncertain glances. Reynolds adjusted his tie, clearly trying to formulate a response. Judge Winters tapped his fingers against his desk before turning toward the prosecution. "Counselor, do you have an explanation for this?" Reynolds straightened his posture. "We still have fingerprint evidence, Your Honor." Carter gave a slow nod. "Good," he said, "because I was just about to bring that up." The tension in the room thickened. Carter stepped back to the defense table, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. He had their attention now, and this was just the beginning. The murmurs in the courtroom hadn't died down. Carter had just thrown the prosecution off balance, and everyone knew it. Even Judge Winters, who had been smirking just minutes ago, now looked at him with something closer to curiosity than amusement. Reynolds cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Fine," he said, regaining some of his composure. You want to talk about the fingerprint evidence? Let's do that. Carter nodded. Let's. He stepped toward the jury, keeping his voice calm and steady. Prosecution claims my fingerprints were found inside the stolen vehicle, specifically on the steering wheel. Reynolds folded his arms. That's correct. Carter gave a small shrug. Then I have one simple question. He turned, locking eyes with Reynolds. When were those fingerprints collected? The question seemed to catch Reynolds off guard. He hesitated for half a second before responding. They were processed after the vehicle was recovered. Carter tilted his head. How long after? Reynolds shifted slightly. 2 days. A few jurors frowned. Carter saw it. He stepped forward again. 2 days, he repeated, nodding slightly. So, the car was left abandoned, sitting out in the open, where anyone could have touched it, for 2 whole days before the police collected evidence. Reynolds exhaled, clearly trying to stay composed. That doesn't change the fact that your fingerprints were found. Carter let that hang in the air for a moment before he turned toward Judge Winters. Your Honor, is the forensic specialist who processed this evidence present in court today? The judge blinked, caught off guard. He turned to Reynolds. Counselor, was the fingerprint expert subpoenaed? Reynolds hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he said, No. Carter gave a small, knowing nod. That's interesting, he said, because I'd like to know exactly how those prints were analyzed. What method was used? Were they full prints or just partials? Were they smudged, overlapped with other fingerprints, or properly preserved? He turned back to the jury, his voice measured but strong. Because here's the thing about fingerprint evidence. It's not as perfect as they want you to believe. If the prints were partial, they could belong to anyone with similar ridge patterns. If they were collected improperly, they could have been contaminated. And if the car was left sitting for 2 days before evidence was processed, he let the words sink in. Then, how do we know those prints weren't left there before the car was even stolen? Silence. The jurors were shifting now, looking at one another. The people in the gallery were whispering. Even Judge Winters seemed to be weighing what had just been said. Reynolds, however, was trying to keep his frustration hidden. You're grasping at straws, he said. Fingerprints don't just appear inside random vehicles. If yours were in that car, it means you were there. Carter turned to face him fully now, his confidence unshaken. Let's say you're right, he said. Let's say my prints were inside that car. Here's a thought. What if I had been inside the vehicle before it was stolen? Reynolds let out a short laugh. Oh. And why would that be? Carter reached into his back pocket and pulled out another folded paper. Because the owner of the vehicle, Mr. Leonard Vaughn, happens to be a friend of my uncle's. I was inside that car 2 weeks before it was stolen. A murmur spread through the room. Judge Winters raised an eyebrow. Carter continued, unfolding the paper and holding it up. And this isn't just something I'm saying. Here's a sworn statement from Mr. Vaughn confirming it. Reynolds' jaw clenched. Carter turned to the jury again. So, let's do the math. We have a fingerprint report that might be flawed, a security video that places me across town at the time of the theft, and now an explanation for why my prints might have been inside that car in the first place. He paused, glancing at Reynolds. Your evidence is falling apart, Counselor. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Judge Winters leaned forward slightly, tapping a finger against his desk. I have to admit, this is starting to look less and less like an open and shut case. The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs. The shift had happened. The same people who had been laughing at Carter minutes ago were now watching him with interest, maybe even respect. Reynolds exhaled slowly, clearly trying to maintain control. Even if the fingerprints have another explanation, there's still the matter of the police chase. Carter smiled. I was hoping you'd bring that up. The courtroom grew even quieter, because now Carter was about to deliver the final blow. The courtroom was no longer laughing. The people who had smirked at Carter in the beginning were now hanging on to his every word. Even Judge Winters, who had spent the entire trial treating him like a joke, was watching him with a sharp, calculating gaze. But Carter wasn't done yet. The police chase. This was the last thing the prosecution had left. Reynolds straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim control. "You can argue all you want about fingerprints and security footage, but there's no way around this. You ran from the police." He stepped closer, speaking with the same confidence he had at the start of the trial. "If you were truly innocent, why did you run?" Carter let a silence stretch for a moment before exhaling quietly. "That's the only part of this case that isn't based on a lie," he admitted. "I did run." Reynolds folded his arms, his smirk returning. "And there it is. That's all the jury needs to know." But Carter wasn't finished. He turned toward the jurors, keeping his voice steady. "Before you decide what that means, you need to understand something. That night, I was walking home. I wasn't near the stolen car. I wasn't doing anything illegal. But when I saw flashing lights behind me, I knew exactly what was about to happen." He let the weight of those words settle. "I've seen it happen before. A mistaken identity case where a kid who looks like me ends up in handcuffs for something he didn't do. Or worse. The moment I heard the sirens, I knew they weren't going to ask questions first. And when I turned and saw officers already reaching for their weapons..." He swallowed, shaking his head slightly. "I ran because I was scared. I ran because I didn't want to end up in a courtroom like this, fighting to prove I was innocent." The room was silent. Even Reynolds seemed unsure of what to say. Judge Winters tapped a pen against the desk, his expression unreadable. "So, you're saying the officers had their guns drawn before they even confirmed you were a suspect?" Carter gave a small nod. "The police report won't mention it, but there were body cams. If the prosecution wants, they can pull that footage right now." All eyes turned to Reynolds. His face paled slightly. He cleared his throat. "Oh, that won't be necessary." A low murmur spread through the room. Carter tilted his head slightly, watching Reynolds carefully. "You didn't even check, did you?" Reynolds clenched his jaw, but didn't answer. Carter turned back toward the jury. "So, let's break it down. The video footage doesn't place me at the scene. The fingerprint evidence is unreliable. The stolen car? I had a reason to have been inside of it weeks before. And the last piece of this case, the only thing that made me look guilty at all, was that I ran because I was afraid." He let out a slow breath. "That fear isn't proof of guilt, it's proof of experience." Judge Winters leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. His face was unreadable. Reynolds, however, knew he had lost. The gallery buzzed with hushed voices. The jury wasn't looking at Carter like a criminal anymore. They were seeing him as a kid who had been caught in a system that expected him to be guilty before proving it. Judge Winters cleared his throat and sat forward. "Does the prosecution have anything else to add?" Reynolds hesitated. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. "No, Your Honor." Winters nodded. He turned to the jury. "Then we'll take a short recess before I give final instructions for deliberation." The judge banged his gavel, but no one moved. They all knew what the verdict was going to be. And Carter did too. He had just won his case. But he wasn't done fighting yet. Because now, he wasn't just proving his innocence. He was proving the system itself was broken. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a battlefield, and Carter had just won. But the weight of what had happened was still settling in. The jury had been given final instructions, and after everything that had unfolded, there was no suspense in what their decision would be. 15 minutes later, the foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. The gallery erupted in whispers, some in relief, others in shock. Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clenched into fists as if trying to hold on to a case that had already slipped through his fingers. Judge Winters remained still, nodding slightly as if he had seen this outcome coming the moment Carter took control of his own defense. Carter didn't celebrate. He didn't pump his fists or collapse in relief. He just stood there, calm and composed, because this was never about just one verdict. Judge Winters tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the room. "Mr. Hayes, the jury has spoken. You are free to go." But then he did something no one expected. He removed his glasses, leaning slightly forward. "You surprised me today," he admitted. "I've been on this bench for a long time, and I've seen a lot of defendants try to talk their way out of a conviction. But you didn't just talk. You dismantled this case with precision that most lawyers don't learn until years into their careers." A pause. "Have you considered law school?" A murmur spread through the room. Carter's lips twitched slightly, the first sign of amusement he had shown all day. "Already working on it." Winters let out a breath, shaking his head. "Well," he said, "I hope I never see you in this courtroom again, unless you're sitting at the attorney's table." With that, he banged his gavel. Case dismissed. Carter exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. His fight was over, but his mission had just begun. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside felt different. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his direction. He ignored them. He wasn't here for the spectacle. His mother stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You had me scared half to death," she muttered. Carter grinned, running a hand through his hair. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She exhaled, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You're something else, kid." Across the street, standing near a police cruiser, Judge Winters watched him go. His expression wasn't one of annoyance or amusement anymore. It was respect. Because Carter hadn't just won his case. He had forced the system to look at itself, and this time, it blinked first. As he walked away from the courthouse, Carter knew this wasn't the last time he'd be in a courtroom. Next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the one fighting for others like him. How many people have been wrongfully accused just because they didn't have the knowledge or resources to defend themselves? How many cases have been decided by assumptions instead of facts? Carter had been lucky. He knew the system well enough to beat it. But what about the people who don't? The justice system is supposed to be built on truth, but it only works if those in power choose to uphold it. Today, Carter forced them to. But tomorrow, someone else might not get the same chance. So, if this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep fighting for fairness, for justice, for change. Because next time, it might not be Carter. It might be someone you know,